Welcome to chessopenings.com. Today we're going to take a look at the French, which is a very solid opening for black that offers counter chances. Let's take a look. The French defense begins with the moves pawn to e4 and pawn to e6. And now white's idea is that after this almost universal reply d4, setting up the ideal pawn center, black will play pawn to d5 and set up a stronghold for himself in the center. I like to think of the French defense as a deep psychological strategy on black's part. Black goes ahead and he just accepts a modestly cramped game in exchange for some simpler strategic plans and a closed position. Black can comfortably play for his plans and avoid an early tactical battle, and he can also avoid a theoretical contest to see just who knows how much theory. This is one reason why this opening is so popular with beginning and intermediate players. Let's get acquainted with some of the charm of black's strategy. And to do that, we're going to focus on the advanced variation, which begins with the move pawn to e5. This is a reasonable reply to the French defense. The only way white could have opened the game would have been to exchange the pawns on d5, but this has a reputation as being a very drawish structure because the pawns are symmetrical and things are very likely to be traded down the d files here. So normally white doesn't want to take on d5, so it's very reasonable for him to, at some point, advance this pawn. But today we're going to look at what happens if he does it straight away. Now that black has induced white into playing pawn to e5, black's ready for the second stage of his plan, which is to start laying siege to the center. He wants to do that with breaks like pawn to c5 and pawn to f6. He's also going to want to combine pawn to c5 with some piece pressure against the d4 pawn and see if he can crack down the white center. Now, of course, white also has plans of his own. Since he has a space advantage, he can look, for example, to build up an attack on the king side with moves like f4 to f5, or he can even sometimes find some play on the queen side. At the same time, he's going to focus on maintaining the center, and so it's a big battle of plans here. But one thing is that black's plans are a little bit more easy to play, whereas white's require more finesse. So if white is a little bit less prepared, he can easily fall under an attack in the center or on the queen side. But black also needs to stoically accept a few downsides in the French defense. Black has used one of his pawns for passive defense on the third rank, and this translates into a somewhat cramped position. For example, black's queen bishop looks very sickly compared to all the other bishops on the board, and this is a real problem piece for black in the French. What's more, the white e-pawn is ready to advance to e5 at any moment, so black has to be careful to time natural developing moves like knight to f6, and he definitely tends to rule out bringing the bishop to the otherwise comfortable square on d6. Let's get back to the advanced variation, and black now begins his counter strategy with the move pawn to c5, putting immediate pressure on white's pawn chain here. White has no real choice except to defend this with a pawn with pawn to c3. That way he can always recapture with a pawn and keep his center intact. Now black plays knight c6 and starting to build a little bit more pressure on white, and after knight f3 we reach a standard starting position in the French advance. To help get acquainted with the major aims of the French defense, we're going to focus on just a single key variation today, which begins with the most aggressive move here, and that's queen to b6, further piling up pressure on d4, while also eyeballing the b2 pawn and making it difficult for the bishop to develop here. Now, the interesting thing here is that even though black's move queen b6 has put some pressure on the d4 pawn, black still only has 3 attackers to white's 3 defenders. So at the moment, this is not a real threat here yet to take on d4. How does black bring a 4th piece to attack the pawn? Well, he plans to bring this knight on g8 to the square f5, and he can do this either by taking to e7 to f5, or from h6 to f5, and normally he'll combine this with a well-timed exchange on the d4 square by the pawns. Now, for example, if white just plays the move bishop e2, which is not a bad move by any means, black normally goes ahead and he captures on d4, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now he starts heading a knight to f5. For example, here he even has a sneaky way to set a trap. He plays knight to h6, threatening to bring the knight to f5, And it looks like white can just play bishop takes h6, and indeed this has been played many times. However, there's a little trap here, which is that instead of recapturing the bishop, black would play queen takes b2 with a threat to the rook. And this gives black not only an extra pawn, but also quite a bit of initiative, since, for example, after knight bd2, black would now take on h6, and in addition to being up ahead a pawn, he's still attacking this point on d4 twice. So, backing up a bit, it's important to realize just how rapid black's attack is. For example, if after pawn takes pawn, and knight h6, if white simply castles here, black would already grab the upper hand with knight f5. As you see, we already have enough attackers on this pawn that we are actually threatening it, and because of the attack to the b2 pawn, white can't easily bring out a defender to this point. In fact, he already has a funny problem here. It's very difficult to defend this pawn. So white has a couple of options in this position after knight h6, both of which are taking into account how quickly black's counterplay is coming. For example, he can play b2 to b3, but this makes himself vulnerable to a little check on b4 after knight f5, bishop b2, and now bishop b4 check. And since any interposition here would mess up the defense of d4, for example, if white would play knight d2, well, now he's cut off the queen from defense of d4, and this is just waiting to be plucked off the board. Or if he would play knight c3, he would be blocking the bishop from defense, so here we have it. So after this check, white's best move, it turns out, is to play king f1. And I don't think this is a very healthy setup for white. Yes, he has a small space advantage, but giving up castling rights and not having any real plan here seems like too high of a price to pay. So after knight h6, theory tends to recommend not b3, but a little bit more of a tricky move with knight c3. And again, this is the sort of thing that a lot of players are not going to know in these kinds of positions. And now after the reply knight f5, the idea is that white is going to make use of an in-between move, knight to a4. And now black has to waste some time addressing this attack to his queen. This leads to a sharp position, and there's many ways it can go, but let's just suppose that black plays these popular moves, queen a5 check, and now bishop d2, bishop b4, and our attack on d4 is still going strong right now. But now white simply plays bishop c3, and this leads to an unusual position which should be about balanced according to theory. Let's move back to the situation after black played queen b6. All that analysis just showed is how rapidly white's d4 pawn can fall under attack if he's not careful. Bishop e2 isn't a bad move by any means, and in fact it even has a good score recently, but the traditional move in this position has been this quiet-looking pawn move, a2 to a3. a2 to a3 is a tricky little move that accomplishes more than one thing at a time. With this move, white is aiming to achieve b2 to b4, and this would not only gain some space for white, but would also allow his bishop some freedom to move once again. And black may play this move under many circumstances. He might play it right away, or he might play it after black exchanges on d4, or he might even take on c5 first and then play b4. Now in this position, our previous plan of pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn followed by knight h6 doesn't make quite as much sense here, since white now has the simple move pawn to b4. And after knight f5, he would then have, let's say, bishop to b2. White's pawns are much more comfortably arranged on the queen side in this case, and it's difficult for black to gain counterplay. For example, if he were played a5, then white would simply go ahead with b5. At the same time, white can always play g2 to g4 at some point in these positions, which is a very common strategy in these positions, and this will also reduce the attackers on d4. So this is not exactly how black wants to play this position after white plays pawn to a3. Fortunately for black, there is a pretty simple reply to all of this, which is simply pawn to c4. Now, due to the en passant rule, if white were to play pawn to b4, black could simply capture the pawn with c takes b3, using the en passant rule. So c4 makes pawn to b4 very difficult to achieve. The second point which c4 has going for it is that it fixes a pretty big weakness on the b3 square, which might be useful, for example, for a knight if it could arrive there. However, it's a little unclear to assess who has the upper hand on the queen side, or who benefited most from this move pawn to c4. And the reason for that is that black did give up his pressure on the d4 point, and this allows white to now get on with his development and start playing for his own attack in peace. Play tends to continue with the move knight b to d2, and white hasn't entirely given up on the idea of trying to move this pawn. In this case, he probably wants to play it to b3, trying to break down the pawn chain for black here. So to avoid this, black plays knight a5, and finally, white tends to get on with his development of the king side here, either with bishop to e2, or with something like pawn to g3 followed by bishop g2. And in the long term, what white wants to do is he wants to build up an attack on the king side, either by eventually playing for f5, or in some cases he even plays the h-pawn all the way down to h6. And this is just one idea. This is actually the main ideas for white in this position. On the other hand, black has a very long-ranging strategy of his own to play on the weakness squares on the queen side. So for example, he might play bishop d7, and quite often he castles queenside in these positions, maneuvers the knight over to some area in the queen side, and just plays for an initiative on this side of the board. This is a fascinating position to study, and it's very representative of the sort of strategic battle that the French defense can lead to. While I'd say that white might have a bit of an initiative here, this is exactly the sort of closed, strategic game that black is probably more comfortable with if he aimed for the French defense. Well, that's what I wanted to show for today. We've touched on a lot of important strategies that are unique to the French defense, and we've gotten a foothold on this important opening. Perhaps you'll choose to deepen your exploration of this opening on either side. Until next time, thank you, and we'll see you again.